All right, greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Akuno. I'm with the Institute for Social Ecology and Cooperation Jackson, and we are doing our monthly series on race and ecology and the environment as part of our ongoing series with the ISE. So I want to thank you all for joining us. Today we have Kamau Franklin, one of the founders and coordinators of Community Movement Builders, and long old friend, comrade, accolades that could kind of run for days. As I think the testament on the gray hairs on his head could kind of allude to, a veteran in the struggle and playing a fundamental role in the struggle to stop Cop City in Atlanta, which is going to be the focus of our conversation today. So to reiterate, folks, how this is going to go, we want to elicit in as much kind of questions and feedback from all of you, particularly as this is kind of an urgent action item. So this one's going to be a little slightly different in our format than how we've done some others. But typically I just do a couple of questions, with Kamau, to get a couple of things going, bring a couple of things up, and then open it up for questions. And the questions primarily, depending on the size of the audience that's with us today that joins us, we either typically do by chat, and I read them to Kamau, or if there's just enough of us, we kind of make it an actual conversation. So I'll give folks some feedback on that as we go along. And to just want to get right into it so we maximize time. I'm assuming at this point, since you're all here, you know some basics about Cop City. If not, we'll cover a few, some details. But the first thing I really wanted to touch on today are the action items, right? The call and the move to action, the nature of the urgency of what's at stake. So, Kamau, we know, community movement builders and allies on the ground in Atlanta have called for a day of action on March 9th. Could you start us off with telling us, what is the call, what's the aims and objectives, and how can people plug in?
Yeah. So the call on March 9th is actually even a broader call than just Cop City, right? Part of us, we have here in Atlanta, that's going to be part of a whole week of action, which is geared towards stopping Cop City. There's going to be literally hundreds of people from what we are getting now of folks who'll be coming to Atlanta. But mixed in that with the recent killing of Tyree Nichols in Memphis and some of the other killings that have taken place, in terms of looking at the landscape, it's feeling like there's been a de-escalation of movement tactics to be out in the street. Whether or not that's been purposeful, whether or not that's just a sign of the times in terms of the conditions, folks being worn out, folks feeling like, hey, we just did that in 2020, we can't get back out there as much. Part of it was like, there needs to be a larger call against police terrorism and violence around the country. And so we decided that, again, with folks in Memphis and some other players, that we would begin with making that call. And so March 9th is a day against police violence and police terror, highlighting Cop City here, highlighting the killing of Tortuguita, an organizer who was killed in the forest, who was recognized as a forest defender, and the killing of Tyree Nichols in Memphis in particular. And that with those and the other things that are happening on the ground in local areas around either the militarization of the police or the killing and over arrest, the police industrial, the prison industrial complex, all that stuff is still here and still going on. And what we need to do is to try to attempt to mobilize people again to be out on the streets. And so far we've had about 12 or 13 cities before we even made it public who've already said that they're going to be doing actions on that day. We've already teamed up again, Cooperation Jackson, Cooperation Vermont, the People's Programs in Oakland, Black Alliance for Peace, recently Movement for Black Lives has endorsed, and they're going to put out some information on it. PACA in DC, and several other organizations which are grassroots organizing groups from around the country. So we are excited about the possibilities. We're excited about getting folks back out in the street. We think if we hit 20 to 25 cities, that would, at the minimum, that would be a successful day of action for us to do. And our demands are both, again, not only the local demands that each city will have, but we got to be back out in the streets around this issue of police violence. And if we're not out in the streets on this issue, then these localities and the federal government get to do nothing. And that doing nothing means that our folks continue to get killed.
So how can people plug in? We're gonna go through this now and then go through it. You know, and just so folks are clear, if you are not in one of the cities that he's already mentioning, hopefully you would know. Want everybody to walk away from here figuring out what you can do in your city and plug in. So how can they plug in?
Yeah. So we have a website that we just put up called nationaldayofaction.info. That's nationaldayofaction.info. On there, there's a place to fill out if you're interested in doing an action in a particular city, that you can fill out a form basically and send that to us. When we're going to start building out, as I mentioned to Kali a few seconds ago, we're going to start building out the page with locations and times of actions on that date. And so we definitely want folks to do what organizers do, right? Take the lead, do an action. It could be a rally, a demo, a teach-in, anything that you think can bring public awareness, banner drops, whatever you think can bring public awareness to the issue. And again, to get folks back out into the street. So dayofaction.info is where you go. There's already a list of cities that have said they are doing it. And again, the next step for us is to add locations and times in which this is going to take place. And so we're going to give people as much tools as they need in terms of, again, national demands, things that people can do, particularly around the Cop City issue. But again, we want folks to emphasize what's happening locally and use this as a jumping off point for further actions. And then we hope afterwards to reconvene at some point with not only the groups who've been doing this for a while, but the new groups who usually form out of something like this, so that we can continue to have conversations on working collectively and continually on a national basis.
Now, before we get into some of the politics and the dirtiness of the politics, give us a sense of what's happening on the ground now, just in Atlanta.
So right now, yeah, I mean, so the police have pulled out, let's say, all the stops. So what we've had happen now is that they've cornered off and fenced up certain areas of the forest. They've basically pulled their militarized policing gear out. You see tanks, you see folks in flat jackets, you see SWAT teams, you see AR-15s, you see a host of the militarized policing that we know is only going to redouble itself after Cop City is being built. But you can see it on display now. And that's all about stopping forest offenders from coming back into the forest. They've also continued, and we're going to talk about this in a few seconds, with their public narrative of criminalizing the movement and or calling folks outsiders. But they've basically tried to cordon off the forest. There are still ways, and there's still folks who are going to the forest. There's still actions going to be planned in and around the week of actions that are coming up, that are going to be about people getting close to the forest, marches and demonstrations, even some sit-ins. And so that stuff is still going, but the tension that is around it has not dissipated. Is that the city has now decided to go full blast after the killing of Tortuguita, and the extra charges of domestic terrorism that have been leveled down against 19 different organizers and activists. They went in and they got the permits. They did something where they were, the Atlanta Police Foundation in the city were having trouble getting their permits from DeKalb County, which is where the land is located, even though it's owned by the city and now leased to Atlanta Police Foundation. So they had some backroom deal, another backroom deal, where now they have basically given written out the permits for them to start their build completely. And so now it's just a matter of whether or not we have the people, the time, the pressure mechanisms to slow that down and or to stop that. But they've taken this time period now to go full blast in terms of cordoning some of that area off and beginning some process of building out what Cop City could ultimately become.
So this is immediate escalation from where things were at in January.
Definitely. It feels like since December, each month has been another escalation tactic, particularly by the city and the state, when they saw that organizing and activism on this issue wasn't going away. So in December, we had the first raids on the forest that led to domestic terrorism charges. In January, we had another raid that led to not only additional domestic terrorism charges, but actually then the killing of Tortuguita by the combined agencies, we should say, the Atlanta Police, the DeKalb County Police, SWAT teams, Georgia Bureau of Investigation, Georgia troopers, some say based on media reports, even the FBI. All were out there that day that Tortuguita was killed, was murdered, but yet there is no body cam image of that actual scene of him being killed. After that, and as we know, there was a march in the streets of downtown Atlanta. Other folks were arrested and also charged with domestic terrorism. And then post that, as I stated, they went and got the permit and then started to cordon off the forest for there to be a section for them to start working on and building out. And so that's been the sort of each month now since December, there's been a heightened level of state repression and or state response to try to make the movement go away.
All right, so let's get into some of the politics a little bit more. This is happening in a Democratic city. It's happening in a Black-run, nominally anyway, Democratic controlled citadel. But it's taking place with a great deal of collaboration, both with some major players of capital, which we'll get into, but also coordination with the state, right? So how's this playing out in the Black community? And I want you to link that with I got my own views, but we want how's this playing out with the Black political class in Atlanta, which has been I would say nominally been making some national moves, on the heels of what some of them were able to do through coalition to put a Black senator in place. It was 2 years ago. And then the play that some of them also made for the governorship, right? These are some of the same folks who are now pushing Cop City. How do we explain that?
We explain it by saying that the Black political elite has always been tied to the white economic elite, not only here in Atlanta, but of course, all over the country. But here in Atlanta, there's always been a special relationship that's been formed, right? And so even before there was a political elite, there was basically a minister or reverend elite, right, of Black folks because of the numbers in Atlanta. And they basically, had common cause with the white elite of like, hey, even though Atlanta is considered the birthplace and or the cradle of the civil rights movement, sometimes is spoken about, there was never a real civil rights movement here, right? And that's because the agreements were put in place as like, don't do that boycotting stuff or that sit-in stuff here. You can take that to other places. We won't have the police call the dogs out on you. But what we'll do is, you know what, when you tell us your folks need some housing, we'll put some housing in these segregated areas. They won't be as good as the other housing we build over here, but at least you'll get something. And so the agreements were struck that some nominal amounts of resources that some Black institutions could control would get divvied out. As the Black population grew and Jim Crow was coming to an end, it became obvious that Black political leadership would be taking over. Then the deal was struck with the Black political elites, and again, that same white economic class, whereas you can officially run the city, but you're going to do it on our behalf, right? And that's been, since again, the 70s and the 80s, since we've had Black mayors, we've reached a period where Atlanta used to be 60% Black, and now it's 49% Black. The gentrification, and as I know, is happening all across the country, but here in Georgia or here in Atlanta, it is really rampant, right? It is really out of control, where the Black population, poor working class Black people have been literally pushed out of several different neighborhoods in Atlanta that no longer look anything like they used to, and no longer have any remnants of a Black population, of a Black working class into a poor population. This has been something that's been guided by the Black political elites, the Black political elites who are Democrats. And just as we have in all these major cities, right? anytime there's a police killings that's happening in these major cities, they're run by Democrats. And most of the time they're run by, or sometimes they're run by Black Democrats. And these are the people who fight the hardest against any police reform, any conversations around abolition or defunding, alternatives to public safety. Those things are stopped by the Black political elites who also use the police to be the public army for their private corporate sponsors. And so that's no different here in Atlanta. In fact, I would say here in Atlanta, it happens on steroids, where these Black political elites are defenders of police actions. They have all the buzzwords, just like any other, like a large city apparatus around. The cops are here to solve crime. They're our best institution. Just like in the other cities, police officers, or the police budget here is usually anywhere between a third of the total budget to 50% of the budget. And so these people, as you said, have continually supported police, made sure when they ran for office that they were clear on that. All the major candidates for mayor or this time around who won or who were running were supporters of Cop City. All of the major candidates said they wanted it built. The candidate that won, who did not expect to win, Andre Dickens, was a supporter since the very beginning. And the Black City Council, even though it was not a majority Black City Council, the majority of the Black folks who were on the city council were also proponents of Cop City. And so that's continued to happen. And like you said, they've now teamed up with the state apparatus. And so the funny thing here in Atlanta, we should say, to be really specific, or in the woods, is that in Atlanta, you have in the north part of Atlanta, you have Buckhead. Buckhead is the economic engine of Atlanta. It is the place where corporate headquarters are. It's the place where the white elite is. They have been crying particularly since 2020, but before that, after the uprisings, that this can't happen again. And part of Cop City is a response to that. They have demanded that the different Black mayors really take a hard stance on building more jails and building out the police force. That coincides with and some of them have been demanding that if we don't get this right, we're going to secede from the city and create our own city. And our Republican friends who control the state legislature will back us in that. Part of the city's response is to double down, and it would have supported Cop City anyway. But this even further locks in their interest in supporting it, is that what they've basically come up with a deal with is that Kemp, who is the governor, is happy with the response of the city on matters of the police. And so therefore will scuttle any efforts of Buckhead succeeding from Atlanta this time around. And so this stick is held over the heads of, again, the Black bourgeois, the Black elite, who would have supported it anyway, but it's even more so locked in because now they are teamed up with the state apparatus to stop the economic engine part of Atlanta from succeeding away.
You know, one thing I haven't heard in any of the coverage, and I want you to think about it. One of the was it Maynard Jackson? It took me a minute to remember his name. And for those of you who don't know Maynard Jackson, he was the first Black mayor of Atlanta. And one of the critical things that he was able to do, perhaps the most critical thing that he was able to do during his so-called tenure, was get the international airport situated in Atlanta. And originally, the federal government and the forces of capital wanted to kind of place that in Montgomery. But since folks were not willing to desegregate in a particular manner, he was able to kind of sway that over to Atlanta. And that's critical because it made Atlanta a very unique city in the South and in the world, whereas, you know, by far and away, it's still the largest airport with the moving traffic and freight and everything else. That's part of this economic engine that Kamau was just talking about. And that's not too far away from where Cop City is situated, you know, if folks want to look at it geographically. But the main point I'm thinking of here is just the intersection, particularly in Atlanta, you were talking about, between, you know, the forces of capital, how they're concentrated in the Deep South in particular, and this investment in Cop City. Because it's very clear that this scene, it's the foundation, it's the police foundation, right? It's not directly the police. The foundation being a private arm, privately funded in most respects. Like it is very clear from the different institutions that are backing them and funding them that there's a long-term political objective to what they're doing. The capital would not make this level of investment in. So could you talk about, because I'm just thinking and offering a thought, offering a suggestion to those of you out there who may be listening to the recording after or planning on doing something. There's a frontal confrontation with the state in the form of challenging the police, but then there's a piece that we need to be clear on is challenging the forces of capital who are driving, the pit bulls. So if you can speak more to like how that particular piece is laid out, who are the major players and investors, and for folks to think about perhaps targeting them in your area, maybe not on the 9th, since that has a particular theme, but down the road as we're trying to figure out, how to win this struggle, right? And what it's going to take to win to make some change. That's a particular route eventually we're going to have to figure out how to confront. But first, identifying who's who and what their interests are, I think, is a critical part.
No, I mean, I think you are exactly right. Like, so there's not enough that folks know about around the new idea of these police foundations, which again are sweeping the country, right? The Atlanta Police Foundation, the size of the police department in Atlanta is probably no more than the 20th largest police department in the whole country. But the Atlanta Police Foundation is the second largest police foundation in the country. And we think part of that is the very thing that you talked about. The location of Atlanta, the uprisings that took place prior to it, the corporations that have invested, the same corporations that told you that they thought Black Lives Matter are the same corporations that are investing in the Atlanta Police Foundation to build Cop City, which again is very important to understand. The Atlanta Police Foundation is a private entity, that it is a 501c3 entity, that its board is made up of corporate elites, including Delta, Waffle House, Chick-fil-A, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Cox family. All of these folks are connected and intertwined in the building of this police, this training center, this so-called training center, right? And the reason we think of this training center as not just some run-of-the-mill, it's just the police need a new training center, which is part of the propaganda that's lifted up here, is the extent and the build-out of what this space is going to be like, right? So it's 90 acres originally or initially of forest that's going to be cut down or taken away to build this center. They are renting a total of over 300 acres from the city. And again, it is the Atlanta Police Foundation, not the city of Atlanta. The Atlanta Police Foundation is basically leasing the land from Atlanta for $10 a year for the next 30 or 40 years, if I'm not mistaken. And it is the Atlanta Police Foundation, which is going to control the actual training of the police. A public police force is going to be trained by basically a public entity funded by corporations. The city of Atlanta is putting in 30 million, but at the very least, the corporations have put in 60 million. And then we know there's other loans that the Atlanta Police Foundation is seeking for the total build out of this project. The reason this project is so stark, as you said, I'm sure most people have already heard about some of this stuff, but this is a military grade facility that's being built. This facility is going to have space for a Black Hawk helicopter landing pad. It's going to have well over a dozen firing ranges on it. It's going to have places, mock cities for practicing quote unquote crowd control. It's going to have places to detonate explosives and so forth. It's a militarized training base, or basically a police, a military base in the city, right? Just the way we have military bases in other parts of the country, this is a military base for the police and for their training. And they say it on their own documents that their prior training center is a paramilitary training base. So what do you think this is going to be, right? And from the documents that we've gotten, that we've seen through Freedom of Information Act, it's understood that 43% of the police that are going to be trained here are going to be from outside of Georgia. So this is a national project in scope. This training center, which is going to be the largest, or some people say it may be the second or third largest, but it's going to be one of the largest training centers in the country, is being built to train police from all over the country. And then furthermore, the Georgia police, as other police departments, already have a training contract with the Israeli police department. So the National Police Department is coming down here to do additional training, not only with Atlanta police and Georgia police, but it's going to be with police around the country. This is nothing more than what we see as the sort of beginnings of a seemingly national policing force with common tactics and strategies that is going to be located here in Atlanta. And so not only the over-policing of Black and brown communities is going to continue and be extended, and the tactics used against Palestinians are going to be imported here, and the tactics used here are going to be exported to Palestinians. But in addition to that, this is, again, even though this was a project that was developed in let's say, in sight before the 2020 uprisings, this was rushed out after the 2020 uprisings, the movements that where people were on the street, as a response to that. This is Capitol's way of saying, no more uprisings in the street. We will stop that. You're only here to buy products. You're not here to get mad at other things, right? And so we look at some of the stuff that happened in Memphis, the sort of carefully controlled way in which even having a videotape of someone being violently beaten to death did not cause the same uproar and disruption, not only because of the early charges against the police, but because they put out a whole policing strategy of where to be, where to locate their personnel to stop anything from happening. Obviously, a strategy that was done in cahoots with a Black preacher elite of how these things should be conducted in terms of the family being upset and what they should call for things to happen. But they're putting together strategies which are supposed to stop those of us who are organizers and activists from working and building movements on the ground. So we think this is the epicenter of a militarized police force, a privatized, a privately controlled public police force that's happening here in Atlanta.
Yeah, no, that was the most orchestrated piece I've ever witnessed in my 50 plus years on this planet. What they did around that. I mean, to the extent of having a live broadcast with President Biden and the family, that they aired in real time. We can speak on that all day, but the part about the politics of it that I want us to get into. Number one, I want folks to know the name of that program is called Gilly. And it's something in my time in Atlanta worked on with many of the Palestinians, and Gilly stands for Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange. That's what Gilly is. You can look that up, and it's been there. It's not new. I think Gilly has been there since the early 1990s, if I remember correctly. And they've trained scores of police all throughout the United States already. So this is a build on from that. And Gilly is situated at Georgia State University. Mm-hmm. So right in downtown Atlanta, which has been one of the major forces of gentrification in Atlanta, the last 20 years, but particularly I think like the last 10 to 15, it's just grown extensively and been pushing folks out of that little section of what would that be? East Atlanta, even around the MLK Center in that neighborhood. So I want folks to look that up. But coming back to a particular piece around the demobilization of our forces, one of the things I think I want you to touch on, because this is some of the things I've heard in terms of trying to help with the mobilization. The role of philanthropy, liberal philanthropy, being connected with so many of the new crop of Black organizations, really setting terms and limits and conditionalities on them as part of the demobilization piece, and really trying to drive them towards greater voter turnout or greater voter registration but coming into conflict. So what role do you think that has played in this demobilization period that I think we've seen basically since, I would argue, October 2020,
Yeah.
when Democrats in the team Biden basically tried to put all the black petty bourgeois, the preacher class, political class, under his camp and under his wing. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. And we should say, like, this is not new, right? What's happened in this time period is that there is just so much more money in organizing than there's probably ever been in the history of whatever so-called grassroots organizing or organizing around issues of police violence that there's ever been, right? I mean, we go back, we look at the historical record. Remember Malcolm talking about the March on Washington and how basically Kennedy called in the Big Six and said, look, you're going to come here, you're going to come at this time, leave at this time. And if you do that and you do it the right way and you help me push this legislation through, everything is going to be great and dandy. And each organization is going to get $100,000 to start with, if I'm not mistaken, from the Ford Foundation. That's one of the layers of the basis of how this stuff started, right? And then when we go upwards into the destruction of the Black Power movement in the late 60s and early 70s, the destruction of that movement, what was left in place was basically a civil rights strategy, right? Who got to survive that were civil rights groups, voting rights groups, people like Jesse Jackson got to be the sort of nominal representation of Black discontent. And then he was basically corporate sponsored. And then Al Sharpton came along and took that further. And then these corporations, even when, again, these folks who have what you would consider to be similar politics, at least the wordings are similar, right? We now have a time where folks use the language of radical politics in everyday speak like you've never heard it before. And those are some of the most well-funded organizations around this. And basically what happens is you have the Democratic Party, right, who says, you could demobilize or put those efforts into getting us elected, and then we will help solve your problems, right? And so basically there's been a confluence of interest between groups who, and some of them may think that they are doing good work, or some of them may want to do good work. But when someone lays like 10, 20, $30 million a year on your doorstep and say, well, if you do this, this is what you get. And if you drive people to vote for us, we can solve this through legislation. That's been part of that demobilization. And part, obviously around the time of 2020, when all of the stuff came out around Black Lives Matter and the resources that were being spent and how those resources went, that caused a certain amount of demobilization too, particularly here in Atlanta. Like I always tell people, I think our organization, Community Movement Builders, we filled a slot that was left empty by a certain amount of demobilization and, let's say, a crashing of an organization, because then people started leaving the organization, or couldn't figure out what it wanted to do or what wanted to be the resources. And people just went back to doing other kinds of work or didn't do any work whatsoever. That left the space for an organization like ours, at the very least, to come in and fill that spot. So, we also get foundation money, we get grant money as an organization, but we try to make sure that we never take resources that are going to tell us what we should and should not be doing, right? And we try to make sure that that is a starting point. And sometimes the thing is so insidious that they don't have to tell you anymore, right? It's kind of like you're trained to understand what should be taking place and what should happen, right? The other thing I think is happening, this is my own private peeve at this stage, is that there's a lot of trainings that are being offered. And that seems to be another realm in which work gets done in the nonprofit circle, is that folks will come and do trainings. But if you have the skill base, what we really want is the actions, right? Most of these folks are 20 or 30 or 40 years old. They're like our contemporaries or younger for some of us. But it's like, I don't need you to train. I need you to do, right? Like we're not at this stage where any of us have run some revolutionary project that has changed things, where like you can come in and just say, this is how you do ABC. It's like, we're all learning, we're all acting together. You've gotten some skills. Let's use those skills. Let's not just come in and train with those skills and go to another place and then train that way, right? Because that's another way in which folks say, hey, we're doing this kind of work. And look, we've trained these folks on the ground. And so these foundations should give us more resources, right? The foundation class, again, as well-meaning as some of those folks are, for the most part, right, those folks are not radical. What they want us to do is to put our issues within policy and legislative solutions which will never really be built out in terms of doing anything different for what's happening in our community. So again, during a time period where we've had the biggest influx of cash in movement politics, we can't say that we've got legislative victories or policy victories which have led to a decrease in police shootings against our people, right? Which has led to a decrease and even in prison industrial complex, right? During this time period. The only dip in the prison industrial complex was during the Great Recession, when states could no longer afford to build the jails. It wasn't, to be, let's be honest, it wasn't like a movement centered activity that led to even a slight decrease in those numbers. And now with this new narrative, the new crime wave narrative, they're going back to their old ways of saying we need to build more prisons. So that, as a quick adjunct on to the building of Cop City, Fulton County, which is the county that most of Atlanta is located in, has now come out and said it's building a $3 billion jail, right? They've already rented the jail space from Atlanta, which was supposed to be closed down, but again, they instead rented it to Fulton County. And now in addition to that, Fulton County is putting out the idea or putting out the plan to build a $3 billion jail. Once they build it, they're going to fill it, right?
Mhm.
So.
Well, before we get to some questions, I was leading with that, questions from the audience, I was leading with that. One of the things that I know that I was hearing early on, well, I shouldn't say early on, but in November, December, in particular, trying to move different forces, was that, the resistance, the forest defenders, the issue in part itself was too white and too anarchist, right? And a lot of folks were saying, well, we're kind of like hanging back, kind of waiting and seeing. I want to argue very lovingly with it, folks, that it was that kind of position and demobilization which enabled the terrorism charges. Because it allowed for low-hanging targets to then set the as far as the state is concerned, to set the tone and tenor and set it in such a way that everybody would then be paused as to, well, if I show out, then I show up. Will I be tagged with a domestic terrorism charge? But this is a particular piece that I think we need to really interrogate in our movements going further, because part of that I know is a historical dimension between left forces, right? And folks figuring or thinking or holding a position or a view, accurate or not, doesn't really matter, that anarchists are too adventurous and too dangerous. But what was keen to me about some of the conversation that I had, just to be honest, was that, my struggle with folks is that you're actually adopting the counter narrative to what happened in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
When, some of the things that popped everything off were then blamed on either adventurous or provocateurs or anarchists, right? But in truth of the matter, if it wasn't for a certain type of confrontation to emerge, particularly in the Twin Cities, it would not have popped off to be the mass movement that it became. How is this particular issue now being addressed in the organizing work, on the ground in Atlanta? Because some of that was coming from forces in Atlanta. Folks, to be clear.
I mean, I would say that one, you're spot on. Like, so since the early idea of fighting against Cop City, it's really been activist driven, right? So this has not been something that we've gotten some community folks involved, but this has really been organizing and activist driven. And a lot of the organizations and activist folks have been anarchist comrades. They've been comrades who are they don't receive any funding from anybody. They will throw down, right? And we have been the central Black organization involved, and other organizations would not get involved in this issue. Part of it, I think, is the dynamic, the politics of organizations, again, with the funding that they get. That funding is meant to challenge state Republicans. That funding is meant to challenge federal Republicans. That money is not meant to challenge Democrats, particularly at a local level, even if they pull the power and purse strings that are making that's the very reason Cop City is getting built in the first place. So even if that is that should be the first target, because they are the ones on the ground pushing for this to happen, right? That kind of thing, folks have said, we're going to dip to the outside of that. We're not going to confront that. And part of the excuse I think that's given, or the rationale that's given, is particularly when we got to the stage of the forest defenders early on, before the lease passed in the city council in Atlanta. You know, most of the organizing and activism was what you would call standard organizing, right? They were town halls, demonstrations, marches, petition drives. It was the standard thing, call-ins. And once it was passed, part of the movement, as opposed to feeling defeated, said, you know, step 2 is to do direct action and civil disobedience by going in the forest. And I halfway joke about this, but, you know, I'm serious, like, you know, in large numbers, Black folks ain't gonna go live in no forest, right? This is not our tendencies and all that kind of stuff. But enough folks who, some may or may not describe themselves as anarchists, but they're definitely a decentralized, ideological outlook. And some of those folks went there. And then they became the crutch that the city would use to say, these are outsiders, right? These are white kids or whatever like that. And I always tell people, I was like, that basically you have these Black politicians using the language of Southern segregationists. Who was Dr. King anytime he went, or civil rights workers anytime they went to different cities? They were labeled as outside agitators. They were coming to stir up our local population. They got nothing to do with what's going on over here. We are good over here. Get them out of here, right? These Black elected officials, politicians adopted that language in order to continue to drive a wedge between civil rights and or voting rights groups, to make it say that it's only these white kids, these white punks who are against this. Nobody, you don't bother looking away over here. Let's put money. That's they were getting Reverend Warnock elected to Congress again as a senator. Let's put money. Let's get our direction straight and get Stacey Abrams to be our next governor. Those are the things that matter to us as a community. It's not the fact that we're going to build this militarized police center, which is going to focus in on continuing the arrest of Black. 90% of the arrests that happen in Atlanta and Fulton County are of Black people, right? So we have to realize that they were using this language to get folks to not join in with the movement. And it was only after, again, you're right, the domestic terrorism charges, the second level of domestic terrorism charges, and then the actual killing of Tortuguita. And so the national, international attention that this started to get, that other forces decided, and I'm not mad. I want the forces to come in. I wish they had come in earlier, but I want them to come in at this stage, even if we've got political differences or we, in my personal, presentation is not people who've like been in contact with me for a number of years or whatever. I'm not mad at it. It's like, if folks want to throw down and get down, we need that to happen, because we need the Black bourgeois and the elite to not be able to continue to say this is a white out of town driven issue. The rest of us, they just don't see, right? Or they ignore us. They ignore us in terms of the media narrative, right? And so then the other thing they do is to do the good organizer versus the bad organizer. And what I mean by that is, of course, if you do civil disobedience that says that a truck which is coming to cut down a tree, if that engine gets snapped or if that truck catches on fire, it's like you've never seen so much reporting on violence in your life, right? And so those actions are called violence, even when Black folks are killed by the police, and it's never called an act of violence. Even early in our protests, when protesters were being arrested and charged, not on domestic terrorism, but on obstruction of governmental administration or resisting arrest, those actions in which the police were using pepper spray with throwing organizers down on the ground, never termed as violence by the police. But if you burn a truck, then you're violent, right? And so they're using those narratives of outside agitator and violent organizers or activists as a crutch to say, hey, the rest of you stay out. But again, because this reached such national attentions, I think there's been a really deep dive, some really deep dive conversations that have been taking place. Some of the, particularly the local and national organizations, particularly Black organizations, are beginning to jump on this and say, hey, we should have been in this earlier. If we weren't, we didn't know about it for whatever reason, we decided not to. But now some of these groups are jumping in, and we're asking them to jump in as strong and as hard as they can, because that's the way to show the city that these protests are, they are based in Atlanta and from Atlantans. And then lastly, I'll say, is the other reason why it's so important right now is because we know that Atlanta needs to be challenged, because Atlanta is vying again, as it did in the 80s for the Olympics. It is vying for the World Cup to come here in Atlanta. It is vying for the Democratic National Convention to come here in Atlanta. We have to let those folks know that we don't want you here in Atlanta, and that Atlanta is a cost to pay. Even if we can't stop Cop City from being built ultimately, there has to be a political price paid by the mayor of Atlanta, paid by the city of Atlanta, that says that when folks are saying to you, over 70% of the community is saying to you, they don't want this built, it needs to be listened to. When 90% of the adjacent community to the forest is saying that they don't want this to happen, and then you ignore those things and shove this down people's throats anyway, that there's going to be organizing and activism to try to stop this.
One last piece, and then we're gonna open it up. I've seen and been happy to see some narrative shift, right? Starting to take place. And I want you to kind of elevate that. I mean, y'all have been working on it from day one, and that's what we'll call it, the ecological or environmental aspect of this, right? Because it's critical, it's keen to me that the property of the police being damaged is viewed as violence, but actually destroying a forest, a lung in a community is just considered development. It's not considered violent at all, right? So, I've seen some things that have started to emerge where people are equating different aspects of this type of development, if you want to call it that, as being a violent act, which it is, right? Let's be plain and simple. This whole edifice that people want to call, civilization is built upon a deep extraction and destruction of the natural environment. And so I'm starting to see more resonance of that, some from somebody, I think some indigenous comrades I saw from Oklahoma came over, and it seems to be that some of the deeper connections on ecological questions, the indigenous questions, are starting to come together a little bit more in this struggle. Is that your sense, or and how is that starting to resonate in some of the conversations?
Yeah,
that's
definitely my sense. And I think, again, it's been something which is been an attempt by the movement since early on. It's been something that, again, when city council voted this in and the forest defenders went in, knowing the history of what's been dubbed the Wilani Forest, and prior, the fact that it was the land of the Muskogee people who were pushed off, basically shoved off through ethnic cleansing and genocidal acts off the land, and it's been used as a plantation and prison farm, that the history of the land has been one that's been used as abuse against people. And that one of the key elements was like, hey, if this is going to be something that's going to capture the imagination of folks, we need some of the folks from not only the Muskogee tribe, but other native nations and tribes across the country, across the continent, to begin to talk about land back strategies and as you termed it, the way that what is considered development, and that having a forest that is intact, that acts as you said, as one of the four lungs of Atlanta, which help with the environment and during this environmental disaster or period that we're in. It's extremely important to bring that to the front. And so having different indigenous people who are starting to come down, who are starting to talk about doing encampments themselves, who are coming down in great numbers for this week of action happening in March, though that has been a great turnaround or a great positioning in terms of changing the narrative. The location of the forest is in Southeast Atlanta, and again, as stated earlier, it's adjacent to a working class community which is 70% Black. That forest was promised to that community in terms of remaining intact for several reasons, right? One, as a place for camping, a park, trails, all of that was supposed to be quote unquote developed for that community, one that did not disturb the forest, but added to the ability for folks to enjoy it who are right next to it. In addition, there's flooding problems in Southeast Atlanta, and the cutting down of that forest will only add to that in great numbers, or in great amounts of more flooding that's going to take place in that local community. And so it's it's just, I don't want to say it's not that we don't understand how capitalist development works, but the fact that they can only see the value in the land by cutting it down for a militarized police training center, and in addition for a Hollywood studio, which is on the other side of the forest, is that that's what folks think development is. And that's what, again, the Black elite has brought into or agrees with, that this is what development is. Gentrification is basically development, because it means it's progress. When corporations come in, it means it's development. That they call that progress. When they're pushing out poor working class people, like they did when they built the Olympic Stadium, when they push folks out, that is considered progress for them. So anything that disrupts poor working class people and gets them out of the city, particularly Black folks, is considered progress. They can still come back to work, right? But it's almost like an economic sundown town, right? You can come back into the city to work and do your job, but once your work shift is over, we don't want you living here and staying here. We want you to find someplace to sleep. If you do, someplace outside of it, because this is now unaffordable for you.
A lot more to build on, but I want to open it up to questions. And I think given the size that we have, folks can kind of come on directly or put them in the chat. We can go from there, and we'll take about like 30 minutes on that. So the floor is open. And if you want to speak directly, just raise your hand so I know. Let me change the view here. So we got a question from Max. Says, thank you for this essential analysis. I'm curious what opportunities you see for international solidarity between Stop Cop City and other forest defense occupations around the world. Is there something about charismatic natural sites such as urban green space that facilitates the making of social ecological connections with revolutionary demands? Good question.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of space for international solidarity, or in this adds in national solidarity. And one of the things that's happened over the last several months is again, more media attention and more international solidarity actions. There's been actions in Europe, there's been actions in Latin America. Folks are responding, and actually there are folks who are coming up from different places, because we want the so-called outside agitator to appear in Atlanta, particularly during our week of action. We want folks to come in and show that solidarity, as we want to show solidarity with other forces that are battling capitalism and climate disaster. So we think the opportunities to either, again, do signs and social media directives towards what solidarity can look like, to doing mass actions, to showing up, to obviously donating resources. All of those things people have done, and we want them to do in greater numbers in terms of showing that solidarity. I would like to believe, of course, that the idea of the space has led to a larger commitment of action, right? I always tell people, of course, that our position as community movement builders is that no matter where this thing was set, we were going to be against it. Didn't matter where they built Cop City, whether it was in a forest or an industrial area, doesn't matter. We were opposed to it and would be opposed to it. And I think that same thing is true for a lot of the allies who are using or talking more about the defense of the forest as an additional reason to not build. But our position has always been clear: forest or no forest, we don't want Cop City built. But we doubly don't want it built, right? In the sense of you're going to basically tear down a forest to build, basically to pour concrete over it. That's for you is development. So yes, we do think highlighting what the forest is, what it represents, what was its promise, what was its history here in Atlanta, has done a great job in terms of putting out a story around the abuse of land and people, right? The historical story of what it means to be native in this land and to be basically thrown off your land at the violent edge of a knife and or gunpoint by U.S. forces. What does it mean to be an enslaved African and to be basically on a plantation. What does it mean to be in a prison camp, right? Doing it in that forest area. There's still a youth detention center in that area. Those folks can hear already, because the police already have used that site for training in terms of firearm practice. They hear those firearm practices going on every day so those things bring connections to why it's so important to protect this land and to stop it from being the use or being the place where they put this militarized place on. But again, as always, we are opposed to Cop City no matter where it is.
Any other questions? Floor is open. Yeah, question for Maggie, Kamau. How do you see the community responses change in light of Tortuguita's killing?
Is the killing of Tortuguita and, of course, the terrorism charges, which lifted this up to be something that got real attention on the national and international stage. And so, as folks know, it is described, and I think it's accurate as such, that Tortuguita is officially the first environmental activist killed on U.S. soil. So it is the very tragic, real-time killing of someone who is an organizer, an activist, which led to the fact that we have gotten this attention. It is the fact that the state of Georgia is using domestic terrorism charges against people who were sitting in trees, literally at the time of their arrest, or in huts, literally at the time of their arrest, not engaged in any activity whatsoever that can be closely described as terrorist in nature, right? And at best, they're conducting acts of civil disobedience by being there, right? So it is the heightened repression of the state which has led more coverage for something like this to be discussed and talked about. And the fact that we're having some of these discussions is because of those state actions, which has led to this being at the forefront of people's mind when it comes to solidarity, movement building, and stopping police violence in our communities.
It's another. We didn't touch on that. I meant to touch on it earlier. Just a quick question. Do you think these domestic terrorism charges are going to stick?
There's a part of me that thinks that down the line that some of these charges may have to go away, because this is the first time that this statute has ever been used in Georgia. It's been on the books for about 5 or 6 years. It was done after the killing, I believe, in South Carolina, when the white boy walked into the church and killed, I can't remember how many, but walked into the Black church and killed folks, right? About 6 people. So this legislation happened after that, and it's never been used before. And so this legislation, in our estimation, is very broad in terms of its language and usage. When we look at the arrest warrants don't delineate anything that can be closely considered to be something that could be described as a terrorist act. It's one thing which we would fight against anyway if there was a charge of destruction of property, of trespassing, right? But at least those could make some logical sense. This is really a pressure tactic of one, criminalizing the movement, but also trying to scare people so that they don't go back into the forest, right? So that's what we think these charges are about. It doesn't mean that the state itself, particularly since Kemp is positioning himself potentially for a national run and to show himself to be coming down hard on what would be left-wing activists and organizing, is not something that we see him as sort of turning away from. So the prosecutions could go forward. The prosecutions could eventually just die down until after they build it, and then they just bring these charges down and do some other things. We just don't know yet, right? We know that for the most part, there's been 19 people charged. Most of them are out. The folks who are in are people who've been charged twice or who had other priors. And at this stage, we're working with all of them and their attorneys to give them whatever support that we can in terms of raising resources and so forth. So it's still a question that's up in the air around how far they're going to go with using or trying to actually use these charges to continue on with the prosecution, and how much of this is just around the media stunt of criminalizing folks. And they don't care about the damage done to people's lives or whatever like that. So they have to hold them in jail to prove a point, they will. But we just don't know how far they're going to take this.
We got a question from Laura. She says, I'm wondering if you think there's a risk that the establishment will invoke some of the common tropes about the issue of police brutality in order to rationalize the building of Cop City and other training centers like it as well. For example, responding to criticism of Cop City by using the trope about quote unquote needing more / better police training to prevent racist police brutality. Yeah, they're gonna definitely play that one by claiming that Cop City will provide the needed training or responding to calls to defund the police by claiming that the more we / public funding for police, the more there will be a need for private funding of police.
So yeah, they've already used that. So that particularly the one around training, that Cop City for them is the training facility in which cops will be trained their way out of using violent tactics against the community, that they need that. But it also just happens to be like, if you look at their current propaganda, they already say they're well trained. The officer, the cop that killed Rayshard Brooks here in Atlanta in a Wendy's had over 2,000 hours of training on de-escalation tactics and cultural sensitivity. I'm sure the cops in Memphis, who were, if I'm not mistaken, again, I think we're all college educated officers, had to receive extensive training in terms of de-escalation and handling these things. This is not, and you know, obviously I know that the questioner knows this, so this is obviously not about whether or not they receive proper training or don't receive proper training. This is really about what the use of the police is in the hands of not only the public, but in the hands of a private entity which is funding it. So basically you have a public police force now being funded by private entities like never before. And that's the new area in which the police foundations are coming in to secure funding. And again, they're coming in at this particular time when there was a conversation on whether or not the funding could happen or abolishing. Not that I ever thought seriously that that would happen because of the use of the police by the state. But it's interesting that it was during that time period that they used that as themselves as a tactical advantage to say, let's create another corridor of funding for the police, which corporations will do because these corporations know that the police are used to protect their private property.
Just one interjection that we should have touched on at the beginning, you know, so much to cover, but I just want to bring it up and maybe you can speak to a little bit, but the unit that killed Tyree was in part constructed and trained by a woman who ran a similar unit in Atlanta some years ago. I forget, it was something, the dogs or well, I forget
Red Dog, yeah.
Red Dogs in Atlanta.
Yeah.
And then that got exposed and she, you know, was promoted and hopped around and went over to Memphis. So I'm just highlighting and interjecting because, you know, that example already demonstrates what will happen, right? What is going to happen if they're successful in pulling something like this off, right? You know, and how these things, you know, typically work if folks aren't familiar, you know, cops, you know, gets caught on something, kills somebody, hurts somebody, gets sued. You know, they'll take them off the force here and then they'll just move over to another state, you know, and get picked up there like nothing happened, right? You know,
and here
so,
in Atlanta, we had, when I mentioned the cop that killed Rayshard Brooks, you know, he got his job back. So he's back on the Atlanta police force. Yeah. And in the origin, you know, we know there's like in these units, In New York, we had the street crimes unit.
Mhm.
And that's basically the same types of units, which are undercover units or street units that are meant to pull people over in pretextual stops to claim that they're trying to see if they had a broken tail light or they're drunk, and really their claim is that they're trying to seize weapons, right? But really these folks have become the sort of the sharpest edge of the knife, because they're the ones pulling people over, dragging them out of cars, trying to show that they run the block, they run the community. Anybody out at a certain time must be criminal, and they must understand that they don't control the neighborhood. These police units do. They have their slogans, their names and their slogans, which are militarized and or violent in nature, to show that they are the commanders and the controllers of the block. And again, like you said, these are tactics that they train in already, and these will only get more extensive and again nationalized under the umbrella of a cop city here in Atlanta.
Got a question from Joseph, who asks, could you speak more to the multi-agency focus of Cop City, the local, state, federal kind of intersection? The lines seem to me to be increasingly blurred / merged, which is concerning. Maybe one police force for all of the US. Also couples with my perceived increase in activists getting arrested on state and federal charges simultaneously. Maybe this has always been the case.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain elements that have always been the case. What we see here in this particular task force, I mean, let's think about it again. All these disputes between Republicans and Democrats, and how we're supposed to acknowledge that there's some real difference between them. Basically, we have a moderate liberal Black Democrat who's teamed up with a right-wing, overtly racist Republican governor who's teamed up with Joe Biden, the moderate Democrat. And I say teamed up with Joe Biden because it is the Justice Department is also looking at potential charges. The Homeland Security is a part of this task force, and the FBI has been a part of this task force. So all these agencies, from a federal, state, and local standpoint, have all agreed that the prosecution of organizers and activists who are opposed to police violence is of #1 importance, and using tactics that, again, call them domestic terrorism is okay with both the city, the county, the state, and the federal government. You have to remember, like, even no one at the January 6th insurrections, so-called insurrections, have been charged with domestic terrorism. In fact, a cop was killed that day, right, when they did that, and they all walked away. Remember, there were no arrests that day.
No arrest.
So basically, it was just like, okay, see ya. See you for lunch next week, Harry. Okay, officer, whatever. So we have to remember, this is a very explicit, and again, as the history shows us, most policing agencies have always been lined up against left forces, right? When we look back at the history of the civil rights movement, when civil rights workers were being killed, when everyday African people or Black people were being lynched, the FBI didn't line up forces with local police departments to go after right-wing forces, the Klan, and to go into their own policing agencies to weed that out. Their focus was on civil rights workers and stopping them and arresting them and having them thrown out of town or turning them over to the local Klan apparatus. It was scaring their local citizens. The FBI did not act as a way to protect the public from right-wing violence. It participated in that violence and extended it. And that same thing is happening now, where, of course, it doesn't, the larger nature of the state is whether unless the right wing can take over the state, which they may be in a position to do, of course, but is to protect the state. But part of that protection of the state is to go after left forces, because left forces have less power because of their anti-capitalist nature. Right-wing forces, for the most part, who adopt capitalism, but just think capitalism needs to be spread a little bit more lovingly back to them again. They're not the huge focus of policing activities, because for the most part, they're also part of the government and they can protect themselves.
I would just add, I mean, the US already has several federal if you want to look at it, several federal policing agencies. I mean, there's an alphabet soup that exists already in the United States. In effect, the FBI are a federal police force. ATF is a federal police force. DEA is a federal police force. Homeland Security, which is an overlay, now of all of those in many respects, is a federal police force. So we, that kind of like infrastructure and the fragmented nature of how they kind of act and pursue, I think it's long been a feature of how they, kind of decentralize a certain level of control, but also are able to kind of cast illusions around this particular project being democratic. Right. But when you actually look at what the United States is, I mean, largest military in the world, largest surveillance capacity in the world. And we are policed like no other country in the world, right? Like, George Orwell would be in horror to see what the United States truly is, right?
Yeah.
Even he gave some warnings about it, but it has a veneer of being democratic, and that you can elect a sheriff, right? Presumably, and these things such as that. So it kind of makes it seem as if we are electing to have all of these repressive kind of instruments and apparatus. So this is some propaganda about this particular settler colonial project that's going to take a lot to undo. Yeah. Because so much of this, I would argue, y'all, there's the parts of it that we, kind of know to openly resist, but then there's the acceptance of this level of surveillance at every level, that takes place, which, we all, well, not all of us, some of us are too young maybe, but, those of us who were of age, before 1991, right? And the collapse or demise of the Soviet Union, y'all remember very well being raised with this narrative that that society was a surveillance society, and all your moves and everything are monitoring. And then, I think to me, the line from The Matrix, said it best, right? It was The Matrix 2, where the architect says that, they made it appear as if the surveillance was our choice when they were actually doing the same damn thing. But it's the choice factor, which mitigated some levels, or the illusion of choice mitigated some levels of resistance. I think that was some damn good commentary that we need to dive into. That's in effect on so many levels. I think we got maybe one or two more questions here. Kamau, then we're gonna let you go. Yeah, so Ali brought up, makes me think of how often the National Guard is getting called out to these types of movements. Just so folks know that I would argue that yes, it is more common, but that's also not new. Yeah. If you look at what happened, to our movement, in particular, Black Liberation Movement, in the 60s and the 70s, them calling out folks to Newark or LA or Detroit, or that was common cause. I don't know if you want to touch on that point, then go to the last.
No, I mean, really quickly, like you said, here the Georgia governor did issue an executive order reserving the right to call up the National Guard, particularly after the murder in Memphis. And so the idea was that just in case there was, again, the possibility of uprisings happening, that they wanted to be prepared. And part of that preparation was the National Guard. And then, in an extension of your point, even though there's no national police, the coordination between the federal police and local policing has already been there. So when we talk about these task force, those task force, again, historically speaking, during the Black Power era, were omnipresent between the FBI and local policing departments, and they've continued to be there now in this current time period. And what we think is happening, part of our challenge to this idea of this cop city is, again, that the training that's going to happen at these centers are not just for Atlanta police or even Georgia police. 43% of the designated slots for training is for police from around the country to come here and be trained, which means that is being trained on tactics and strategies, and a national way of looking and practicing is surely being developed even more so than what they're already doing at facilities that are going to be this large to house huge policing contingents coming down here. And so in addition to that, that means there's going to be international training, as we stated, not only from the aspect of what Israel will be doing, but I'm sure other police forces within the Western sphere will come here and receive training the same way you had the School of the Americas, which trained military personnel. You're developing here a place where policing personnel will get training, not only nationally, but internationally. They're going to open up slots to train people.
Yeah, Laura was touching on that in the question about, the School of the Americas, and that being, based in Georgia, for those who don't know. And then Maggie says, maybe you can answer, has there been any coordination with labor working for the companies on the Police Foundation board or in Atlanta? Let me touch on one thing, if I can, come out and touch on 2 points. Because there's a piece that you asked Laura about, like, why Georgia? And I would just offer this from, somebody who trained in military things, from how I was brought up in the movement. Georgia is at a very strategic place geographically for the United States. So one of the big things historically that really kind of for a while, short while, contained, kind of the extensive outgrowth of, the settler colonial dynamic, the land theft and genocide dynamic, was the Appalachian Mountains, right? And it's really Atlanta's strategic because it sits at this little intersection where you can go around the mountains on both sides. So how Atlanta was actually developed, the city was initially called Terminus, right? Mm-hmm. Because there were several train lines that intersected there that allowed, the empire to move goods and services and people, in and around the mountains, when that was a kind of a, somewhat an insurmountable pass, or at least was a delay to moving things from east to west and vice versa. So Atlanta's always, that's why the airport is there. That's why the highway 20 and 85, 75, that's why they're there at that kind of historic strategic intersection. And then for particularly the dominant forces, industrial forces of the North, if you go back and you look at Sherman's March when he burnt down Atlanta, that wasn't by accident. That was like for straight strategic purposes. Like if I'm going to if the North was fully going to win that war, there were a couple of strategic objectives they had to do. One was control New Orleans to make sure that the South couldn't be fortified from the sea by Great Britain or France or other powers that the Confederacy thought might side with them. That they thought about it, but they didn't. But by taking New Orleans, they have removed that part out of the question. Then the land piece was, can we end the facilitation of the movement again of goods and services? In this case, the bullets and the medical supplies and the equipment that they needed to wage war. By destroying Atlanta, they basically just kind of crippled the material will of the forces of the Confederacy to be able to sustain the war for a long period of time. So that wasn't just like cruelty, that was an actual strategic military objective to burn Atlanta to the ground and tear up all those train tracks. That's still the particular dynamic, I would argue, that particular strategic piece around Atlanta being central is still there, and why Atlanta is profoundly different and has been different in the South. And if you want to look at some of what Kamau was talking about, if anybody's interested, go back and read W.E.B. Du Bois' account of the 1905 so-called race riot that happened in Atlanta, where he kind of gives some of the economic analysis of how the black petty bourgeois already existed and was well developed even by that time already in Atlanta, and what role the nature of kind of policing and containment played in that particular the riot. Those dynamics, here we are 120 something years later, they're still fundamentally in place. So I'll leave it to you to close.
No, I mean, I think that was fantastic. No, I mean, I think you are bringing in strategic points of like why Atlanta, and what makes it so important, not only for them to defend, but for us to fight back on, right? Because Atlanta is that place where, you know, it's quote unquote for the South cosmopolitan. It's a place where there's a large percentage of Black folks. So even as the city is being gentrified, the suburbs of Atlanta is where Black folks are going, right? In terms of what folks can afford. The fact that Georgia is the so-called battleground state, all of that is adding to the idea for certain, particularly for corporations, that in the South, Atlanta is a space or spot to land at and to do work outward from. And so having, again, a cop city here protects not only larger interests in terms of geographic interests, in terms of the importance of Atlanta to the larger apparatus of the empire, but also to the corporate development of the South and other places in terms of not only the waterways and access, but the distribution of goods and services. They do not want Atlanta, the uprisings that happened in Atlanta and the way in which they happened were something that we feel like they were surprised at, right? Other cities may have had that before, but that is not something that Atlanta, which has built itself, is too busy to quote unquote hate, or into a place where they can move the state. Again, with the civil rights movement was considered the cradle of, but no activities was happening here because they felt the bargain was struck. And so when it happened, the uprisings, part of it is I think they blamed Black leadership for not being able to control.
No, they did.
Yeah.
They remember he used was it Kemp's name, whatever? He
That was
used that,
go ahead.
He used that against, it was a talking point that they were using against Stacey for a minute.
Yeah. So they weren't doing their historical job as being the Black elite. And so they are, you know, again, the Black elite here has not been a friend to working class and poor Black folks, right? They've decided that their political interests are sided with the white elites that control the country. And so for them, pushing forth the idea of Cop City, I don't think it was controversial. It wasn't like a controversial decision. They just assumed that it would be accepted. Because at first, all 16 city council members, Black, white, and all others, were for Cop City. It wasn't until organizers on the ground were sort of like, what the hell are y'all talking about? Who's asked for this? Who during this time period has asked for this $90 million project, again, coming out of a huge movement to decry police violence, to call for defunding the police and the abolition? No one has called for a sprawling militarized complex in the middle of a working class Black Atlanta area. No one has called for that. So this is obviously a project of the elite, the corporate elite, which is funding it, the strategists amongst the elite who see the need to preserve their control and their ability to control, again, certain communities and movements and activists. And that's why we must stop Cop City and or make Atlanta pay a political price for even trying to build it.
One thing I will also mention, just briefly, before Charlotte became capital's kind of, or I should say banking, that division of capital, Atlanta played the role of the banking center in the South, very deliberately after the Civil War. And it wasn't only, the thing is, Charlotte's kind of taking over that with Bank of America kind of moving some of its headquarters and stuff there. And then other folks follow, but that used to be Atlanta. So you go back and you look at the days of Granddaddy King and some of the things that, you know, he did. And then you know, so that role wasn't just moving the goods and services, because in order to build the railroad, you got to have capital, you got to have money to lay out that infrastructure. So Atlanta, you know, it is the home of that. In respects, folks got to remember. Let's take two more come out, and then I'm gonna let you go because we already passed the hour and 30. One, could you mention the website again for the day of action? And then there's the question, and this will be the last one. How do you see the rapidly changing population of Atlanta, influx of people from out of state detracting from or adding to this movement?
So I'll start. I was looking to make sure I had the website correctly, which I think I did. So let me just make sure. nationaldayofAction.info. So nationaldayofAction.info is the website. So I just want to make sure I got that. In terms of folks who are coming down, you know, there's two things. One, obviously, if I understand the question correctly, you know, gentrification, of course, is something where people, those outsiders, the city of Atlanta welcomes. So let's be clear. There's a certain class of outsiders that the city of Atlanta and the corporations want to come down here to replace. It's no longer needed as in they don't need them to be in the city workforce of working class Black folks in particular, and poor folks. Those folks can be pushed to the perimeters and they just have to come into work. For our movement purposes, you know, we totally just push aside any conversation around outside agitators coming in. We want organizers and activists, militants to come to Atlanta to be a part of the work that's already been happening. I mean, like anybody or any group that's been doing things in a city and building something that we hope to be a movement or continue to be a movement. You know, what folks don't want is folks coming down and trying to take over. They don't want folks coming down and trying to point out all the great ways we could have done things if only they were called earlier. We obviously understand, I think people completely understand that there's holes in the work, that there are things that need to be fixed, that there's tools and apparatus that we need to get, there's resources that we need to help and support us. All of that stuff is things that we need to build a movement, both here in Atlanta and something that has solidarity, again, around the country and around the world. And to continue to, again, one of the things I point out that's happened in this movement time period is that even with people with different ideological persuasions or ideas, we've held it together, right? We haven't fallen apart because we have differences as people who are revolutionary nationalists or eco-socialists or anarchists. We haven't fallen apart because of that. We haven't fallen apart because of the racial and class differences. Some of that we've dealt with, and some of that we will have to continue to deal with. But as a larger movement apparatus, we have not fallen apart. In the last 2 years, we've gone stronger, more connected, we've grown bigger. And so again, this is going to be part of praxis in terms of even after this, right? Even after this, there are other fights that will be had, and maybe we'll be in a stronger position because we were able to hold that fighting guard together, and to struggle through this together and keep things going. So we've, like, you know, from my standpoint individually, as long as folks are coming down to practice that kind of solidarity and unity, they are welcome. We're not looking for folks who are self-described as disruptors, or folks who think they know best, or folks who think they can push aside work that's been done and they think they have all the answers. None of us do. We're figuring it out together. If you want to be a part of figuring that out, please do.
All right. Well, Kamau, want to thank you for spending the time. Thank everybody for participating. We will be doing, following up with this, of course, and be involved on March 9th and beyond. Encourage all of you to do the same. Want to encourage folks to join us for the next in our series around race and the ecology with ISC, where we're going to be focusing in on March. is some updates and a deep dive really about what's happening in Sri Lanka. And, I don't know if folks remember, but basically the government was overthrown, last summer after a pretty significant collapse of the economy, which had been in a free fall for about 2 years. Just because it fell out of mainstream news in the West doesn't mean that their process and their struggle and things to learn from it haven't ceased. So we're going to do a deep dive, doing a 3-part series with Quincy Saul and several folks from Sri Lanka. We're going to be doing these on March 9th, the 16th, and the 23rd, all at the same time. I definitely want to encourage folks to check that out because, signs of social collapse are all around us, everywhere we look. That's part of what this kind of rise of fascism, quote unquote, I would argue is on a global scale. And for societies that have already been through that, and folks trying to figure out how to take care of themselves when trade has been cut off, when, the currency's inflated beyond measure of reason, how are folks still surviving and adjusting? We need to learn those lessons because I would argue some of that at an accelerated pace is coming to a hood near you. So best to start learning now. So check us out then. And then as things keep progressing with the struggle to stop Cop City, we'll stay attuned and invite Kamau and others back. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll catch you again soon.